sister-in-law called the cops on me, so I refused to babysit her kids, and now her life is falling apart. My sister-in-law and I have an agreement. She watches my kids 3 days a week, and I watch hers 3 days a week. This agreement has stood since March 2020 without issues. Any changes have been discussed weeks in advance. A couple of weeks ago, we had an argument. The next day, I brought my kids to her house, dropped them off, and left. I didn't speak to my sister-in-law because when one of us is in a rush like I was, it's standard for us to just let the kids out, stay in the car, and drive off when you see the door open. I drove to work about 40 minutes away. When I got there, I had about 20 missed calls and even more texts, all from my sister-in-law, all saying she didn't want to watch the kids given our argument. Her first text arrived a little before I got to her place, but I didn't see it until I got to work because my phone is always on silent when I drive. I rang her and said I'd arranged to work from home and then come get the kids. She said I had 45 minutes to get back to her place, or she would call the police. I told my supervisor the situation, and she said I could leave after I did a few things. This delayed me 20 minutes. When I got back to my sister-in-law's just over an hour later, she said she'd already called the police when the 45 minutes ran out. I then had to stick around long enough to tell the officer that I didn't abandon my children. There was just a communication issue. My sister-in-law and I had another shouting match later over this. I arranged other childcare for my kids, and I've been mostly ignoring her since. However, she reached out and apologized and has asked if I'd be willing to go back to the old childcare arrangement. I've told her to go F herself. I work with kids. If I got child abandonment on my record, I would never work in my field again, which she knew, and her calling the police was a massive overreaction, so if she needs a babysitter, she can go whistle for all I care. She said that if I checked my phone, talked to her that morning, or came back when I was supposed to, she would not have needed to call the police, and I did this to myself, as she gave me a warning with that first text, and I could have checked my phone or spoken to her directly when I got to her place. All of which she says she would have done if she were in my position given that we'd argued the night before. I've told her that if she thinks I'm babysitting for her, she's fucking delusional, and she's on her own. Because of my refusal, it's looking like she may have to quit her job because my brother and she would pay more for a babysitter than they would earn from her working. My mother and brother have both called me an asshole because there were no consequences to her calling the police and that while she overreacted, she's apologized. So if I really forgive her, I'll let us move on. This income loss would also mean that she, my brother, and my niece and nephew might need to move somewhere cheaper, that my brother might have to take on extra hours at work, and in an extreme scenario, they may even be completely unable to live independently, meaning they'd have to move in with her parents who live several hours away. Update: after all the confusion with my sister-in-law, things got even more complicated. As expected, she tried to pass the responsibility of taking care of the children to my mother, who is already elderly. At first, I even thought it was good because my mother thought I was the asshole in the story, and I wanted to see how she would deal with my sister-in-law and the kids. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity for her to better understand what I was facing. But, as was predictable, it didn't take long for the situation to get out of control. My sister-in-law left the children with my mother 3 times a week without considering the burden that this placed on someone her age. On a specific day, my mother called me feeling unwell with high blood pressure, and I had to leave work to take her to the doctor. Seeing my mother, who had always been so strong, almost being overwhelmed because of my sister-in-law's ingratitude was really tough. And the worst part? Even after my mother fell ill, my sister-in-law did absolutely nothing to ease the situation. She kept leaving the kids there as if it were my mother's obligation to take care of them, even after my mother said it was difficult. Not even a thank you, nothing. And that's when my mother, who previously called me an asshole for not wanting to help anymore, stopped saying anything. She even tried to make me go back to taking care of the kids, saying I was being childish and selfish, but in less than a month of looking after the children and with my sister-in-law acting like it was her duty, she stopped. She never apologized, but I know she understood that I wasn't the one in the wrong. But even finding all this absurd, I'm considering going back to taking care of the kids to protect my mother's health or convincing her to stop and let my sister-in-law and my brother handle it themselves. I don't know what to do or how to convince my mother. After all, as abusive as my sister-in-law is, she's still the grandmother of her children. Honestly, I still don't know what to do, but I'm tired of seeing my mother pay the price for other people's irresponsibility. Update: after much reflection, I was really willing to leave all this behind and try to find a way to move forward. After all, the situation was mainly hurting my mother, and I thought maybe it would be better to let it go for her sake. But as many of you pointed out in my first post, my sister-in-law continued acting exactly as she always did, denying any responsibility and reversing the situation, making it look like I was the villain in the story. Basically, she did what many of you described as a classic Darvo: deny, accuse, reverse victim and offender, refusing to accept any blame and instead accusing me of being responsible for all her problems. And after all this, I kept thinking about what kind of influence this woman could have had on my children, and seeing all this now just confirms to me that sometimes we need to set boundaries for certain people to learn. After all, 3 days a week is a long time to let someone like that be in our lives. Even so, I almost accepted the situation for my mother's sake, but every time I saw my sister-in-law's attitude and remembered everything she put me through, I realized I couldn't just be passive and let this continue. So, I talked to my mother and told her that we shouldn't take care of my sister-in-law's kids anymore. During that conversation, my mother almost begged me to go back to babysitting, but I stood my ground. I love my mother, but I love my kids and myself too. It was clear that my mother didn't want to do it anymore, but she didn't know how to stop, so another trip to the hospital was needed for her to finally put a stop to it. I won't go into details because I still shake just thinking about it, but when she got sick again, my brother went to pick up the kids with the most shameless attitude at the hospital, and I lost it with him. I told him a lot, saying that my mother was no longer in a condition to take care of them, and that if I found out he had left 2 kids with a sick elderly woman again, I would call the police since his wife loves involving the authorities in our lives. Do you think that changed anything? No. The following week, my mother called me saying my sister-in-law had dropped the kids off again. I didn't think twice. I called my sister-in-law and said exactly what she had told me: "You have 45 minutes to come pick up the kids, or I will call the police." I won't lie, I was a bit petty, and it gave me some satisfaction to make her taste her own medicine and feel what it's like to be treated that way. I was angry, but honestly, I don't think I would have had the guts to call the police. Fortunately, she arrived before the time was up, furious and yelling at everyone, saying a lot of nonsense, and I just said, "It's okay, no problem, after all, the police haven't even arrived," acting as if it was no big deal, just like she had done before. When she saw that she wasn't going to upset me or change the situation, she left. My brother tried calling my mother, but I answered, and I told him that the next time, I wouldn't even warn them and would just call the police. After cursing me and my mother with every word he knew, he hung up. My mother is hurt, but I'd rather have her hurt and alive than wait for the worst to happen because of someone who doesn't know their limits. Update. This is my last update. This story is over, and I don't think my relationship with my brother will ever be the same, but they reaped what they sowed. The situation could have been resolved differently if they hadn't decided that I was the asshole in the story. And almost everything I predicted happened. My sister-in-law had to quit her job because hiring a babysitter was much more expensive than the salary she earned. I think the frustration of leaving work and having to take care of the kids 24/7 weighed on her already troubled mind. Besides, my brother started working more hours now that they only have his income to support the household. This must have put a strain on their marriage, and he is currently staying at my mother's house. I don't know if they will get a divorce or not, but honestly, I don't care anymore.